So who's got the first question? Woman in the cardigan there.
I'm so glad that I qualify as a woman. A question really about GDPR, the dreaded data protection. I have to say, a great fan of new technology, and I would love to see the sort of big data translate into all these fabulous innovations for local authorities. I work for a rural local authority, but GDPR, comments from all of you about how we navigate our way around that in a slick and cost-free way.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
I'll give a politician's response by answering what I think is a slightly different question, if I'm honest, but it's a really important topic, and Theo also touched on it. The traditional roots of the economy are property ownership and intellectual property ownership. All of those new businesses are building their value on something else, data ownership. So I think of it as Facebook have captured the graph of who knows each other. Amazon have captured the graph of preferences. If someone buys this thing, they might buy that thing. Google have captured the graph of interest, and now they're monetizing it. But all of those graphs are created from our data. There is no law that talks about how the value is transferred between the data user and the data creator. So I think GDPR is great and very important, but it doesn't remotely go far enough in terms of laying the base for a fair economy based on data.
Yeah, I'll also answer a slightly oblique question. I suspect Theo's got the full tech answer. But I do want to point out that GDPR also affects academic research gathering data as well. And in terms of getting to grips with what's happening in cities now, particularly as they're rapidly changing landscapes, academics are also finding that there's a lot of constraints on what they're able to do with the data that we're gathering from ordinary people actually listening to them. So I think it's got actually quite severe implications. It's got some very important aspects to it, clearly, but it needs thinking through in a range of different aspects, I think.
Answer number one, I think GDPR was a good updating of existing law in an age where a lot of firms have new business models based upon data. The idea that you didn't have to really comply with either existing law, which the GDPR updates, or that you kind of lobby against new laws when it was fundamental to your business model and the consequences are not understood, put the technology sector in a pretty poor light. I think with your answer number two, your question about the public sector, I think there is the interpretation of GDPR and the actual, the reality of GDPR. One of the things we're doing in meaning that people will use GDPR as an excuse not to share information for other reasons. And that's a major obstacle, and that's a cultural obstacle within institutions that don't want to share information. And then you need to examine why institutions don't want to share information. Sometimes they don't want to share information because they don't want to share information. Sometimes, and sort of like equally worrying, they don't want to share information because they've looked at that information and they realise it's all junk, which I would say is one of the challenges with dealing with Whitehall. A lot of Whitehall data is not in a very good state and they don't want to share it because they know that. So what we're trying to do in London with the City Data Analytics Programme is overcome that cultural barrier to information sharing. And we've adopted a technique that you may well know of that's developed in the northwest of the country, the Information Sharing Gateway, which is basically a library of data sharing arrangements for various activities. So someone somewhere has probably shared data on something that you want to share data on. There's a legal agreement for you for that. And so therefore, that's a good starting point, and it shows what can be done on things. Now, that is always evolving, but that's one approach that people are using in this field.
Good. Just to add one thing, I think GDPR does a good job on data and protection and transparency our data is put into algorithms that decide our lives in all sorts of ways, and they are completely untransparent, and there's a lack of responsibility in that. So I think the next stage is for GDPR to move to encompass more issues that I think are going to frame our lives and our cities. Next question. A gentleman here, and then we'll go to the woman there next.
Hi. You all really talked about the importance of this data and the smart city from a kind of city authority perspective in the various ways. Traditionally, technology has been pushed from large corporations. I describe it as people who want to sell kit, personally, but and that seems to actually be the case in sort of many parts of the world. So how can we make sure that things are being brought back to really being led and driven by the city authorities rather than companies who want access to the data or want to sell, supercomputers that aren't necessarily needed, for example? Great question.
Theo, I'm going to put you on the spot first on that one.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the case. And so when you go to the Barcelona Smart Cities Conference, it's full of quite a lot of vendors and cities who have been sort of co-opted by those vendors to promote certain products. And that whole idea of like a big smart city data platform is in vogue in some cities. I was invited to go and view Hanoi's new smart city platform, which I'm sure is like amazing, but not what's needed in other cities. I see a smart city not as a sort of noun, but more as a sort of adjective and a process. That it's about our relationship with technology. It's not a thing that you can buy. And central to, although I talked about data, the central point of our approach is London is, yes, a hub, and it has a legacy, a really good legacy in history around data, but it's also a centre of design in the creative industries, and so on, and that's what makes it stand out. And if you look at government digital service and the design principles that they've applied to the public sector and developed with local government as well, it's really important for us to champion design, which then enables us to express citizen need, to the marketplace in ways we haven't done before. And the reason why the market is as it is not just the fault of the private sector, it's also places a challenge on the public sector to say what it wants, not buy what it's told to, better.
Great. Gillian, do you want to add to this, or? You don't have to.
Yeah, so I mean, I've worked in the two sectors of this that I guess Theo hasn't. I absolutely agree with everything that he's just said, but I worked for IBM for nearly 20 years, which is absolutely one of those companies. And IBM's characterised, as so many parts of this debate are, by two extremes. IBM's at one end, a company of engineers and scientists, and I worked closely with them for many, many years on projects we were deeply passionate about, engaged with local communities, not thinking technology first, all sorts of things. But then IBM's also a tremendously commercial organisation. Whilst I was working there, it made $100 million a year? Was it? No, 100 billion? Yeah, $100 billion a year from something like 250,000 deals. The machinery that drives that engine is incredibly efficient. And so, you do get that split. I think similarly in the wider smart cities sense, you get the top-down versus the bottom-up. Is it big programs versus is it small-scale activity? And I think the secret to all of this will be finding the happy medium in every case. So where I'd really echo Theo's point is it's about how the public and private and third sectors collaborate and find a better model for shared objectives. There's a final part of this answer, but it's actually my answer to Peter's last question, so I'll give that then.
Okay. So just to add to this, I think the biggest barrier is that people like Theo, Theo's a rare breed, and I work. We all work with cities across the country and across the world, and the lack of digital capability at high levels in our city administrations means they're not really able, many of them, to really engage and shape with this technology. And for me, I know times are hard in local authorities, but for me, that's a dereliction of duty in this day and age. So we really need to see more Theos, I think. Question back there.
I think my question goes firstly to Gillian, which was how you were talking about realism in visual aspects, and how is that taken across in reality? How can people that deal with visually giving that communication to the local people, how is that done, and how do you think that could be done going forward?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm not a visual designer, so it sounds like you may have more. So our sense was that, I was saying a bit more realism, in quotes, and I think that was partly around reflecting the diversity of communities and neighbourhoods of the people in a particular location. So there's a lot of kind of cutesy graphics that show actually often quite stereotyped. If there's an old person, well, there's always it's all about digital health because they're ill somehow, and they have to have a lot of the kind of cute young people are, they're the ones who are shown as kind of tech savvy. So there's a lot of, I think, rather lazy kind of stereotyping going on. Personally, that's my view. I think the ways in which places are pictured could be a lot more, again, varied. So, for example, every time we see a smart city, it is always a city centre full of skyscrapers, right? What about the suburbs? What about all those lampposts that that are going to be the infrastructure of the smart city? It's not actually going to be all these whizzy blue networks and the Hunger Games. It's going to be all those rather tatty lampposts, and then I think the final part would be something around acknowledging our everyday experiences of the digital a bit more directly. So, for example, so many smart city visuals simply show Wi-Fi networks working seamlessly. Now, I know clearly that's a huge part of smart tech, although, of course, it ignores all the kind of underground cables and all the servers and the satellites. But actually, of course, we all know Wi-Fi just doesn't deliver. Often, we get into Wi-Fi shadows. You can't, So just acknowledging that, I think, and showing that this is not going to be perfect, but it will be better in these sorts of ways. I think, as I said, we're in a stage now where, partly because so many of these digital visuals are produced across this huge suite of, kind of cultural products. I think just being, as I say, a little bit less glossy and glitzy and, glamorous around those digital glow and flow, and just a little bit more, as I say, realistic. I think that's actually going to be a more effective communication strategy.
Great. Fabulous. So we need to draw to a close. I'm going to put the three speakers on the spot and we'll go down the row and ask them the one intervention that could really help to shape this digital technology, this wave of smart cities to deliver for the citizen. Rick first.
So this will be my answer to the gentleman's question there as well. And I think, again, Theo's probably mentioned it, asking for what we want. You can apply it to procurement frameworks, you can apply it to development frameworks, but I'll choose corporate governance. Why do those companies behave the way they do? Well, because all they're required to do by law is maximise profits to shareholders. If that's all we ask them to do, that's what they'll do. And they'll invest massively in technology to do it. The world said what we want. It's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So why don't we embed them in corporate governance? Then we'll get something different.
Lovely. Gillian?
Mine's a rather major suggestion, rather perhaps impractical, but I think that SMART is as much, I would describe it as a cultural project as much as a technological or a data-driven project. I think it's all about our ideas, our values, actually at heart, that's what will be driving it. And I don't really feel that there's a kind of public forum or a kind of process for having what I think will be quite a complicated, difficult, and quite possibly conflictual discussion about what we, whoever that we is, want from these technologies. But I certainly think we need to have those conversations. And not, for example, think of data always through the Hunger Games or Black Mirror, which I think has a lot to answer for. Let's have a more creative discussion about what kind of future we're moving into.
And I think I agree with both of those points. I think the purer expression of citizen need, I mean, the way in which technology will be adopted and understood by people is if it just does things that people want and makes people's lives easier. The introduction of Oyster and transition to contactless wasn't necessarily smooth. There were people who asked questions about it. At some point, people were thinking that the RFID chip you had was tracked by a satellite, you know, and all of these other things, which it isn't. But they became accepted because it was helpful and useful to people's lives. And we were on a platform before, and I was asked a similar question, and I sort of answered by saying there's a sort of dog shit test here, which is dog shit is one of the main I used to be a local councillor and just by Hampstead Heath, and people just used to moan about the amount of dog mess everywhere, and the council was just not capable of responding to it because there was some cleaning contract with the firm, and you know, and the design was bad. And you know, if we had created an app that dealt with that, people would be really happy. If we did things like, you know, challenged why estate agent signs have to exist in an age where digital advertising is ripping through our society, except for the estate agents world, because it's protected by law, then areas would become less cluttered and more beautiful. You know, maybe not a universal concern for people, but a concern certainly for some. And so there are a range of citizen needs out there that if we just started expressing them to the technology community at large, I'm sure we'd be able to come up with solutions. But that's not the way we've gone about things in the past. So programs like the Mayor's Civic Innovation Challenge, which basically is starting to say, can you solve this particular problem? Here's a bit of money, and we'll give you the contacts with the public sector. Go. It's just a way of doing things differently to the traditional procurement process or the tired old way of doing things. The public sector has to find new ways of forming these partnerships, expressing the need, and most importantly, doing things at first that people really want doing.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, can we all thank three speakers for, I think, fantastic presentation.